All right, well, welcome to Muck You. I'm Moe Davis, co-host along with David Weaver. David's taking the day off, and thank you for joining us. Got a special guest today, a longtime friend of mine, Professor Amos Guiora, is joining us from out in Salt Lake City. Amos grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which I suppose explains his devotion to the Michigan Wolverines. And we're such good friends. Most of you know, if you know me, I'm a graduate of Appalachian State University, and many of you remember the greatest game in football history. And Amos and I have survived that. But Amos is, like I said, a longtime friend of mine and a real scholar and statesman, and someone that we wanted to have on to talk about some of the things that are going on in politics, and particularly outside the U.S. We've kind of been focused over the last couple of weeks on topics within the U.S. But Amos is uniquely qualified. He's an attorney, grew up, as I said, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then spent 20 years in the Israeli Defense Forces, where he served as an attorney, and he was the legal advisor for the Gaza Strip. And the way we met is I was the acting commandant of the Air Force JAG School down in Montgomery, Alabama. And at the same time, Amos was the commander of the the Military Justice School, which is the counterpart of our JAG School. And he came for a visit. And that was some 20 plus years ago. And we've been friends ever since. And Amos's parents were Holocaust survivors. His grandparents were murdered at Auschwitz. As I said, he spent a career in the IDF. I used to bitch about my commute when I was up in D.C. because sometimes it took me 2 hours to get to work. Well, Amos and his family live in Israel, and Amos teaches at the law school at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. So he's got one hell of a commute. He's a prolific writer, on the news quite a bit, providing commentary. He's got a new book coming out we'll talk about called Enablers Across the Ages, Normalizing the Unimaginable. And Amos, really appreciate you taking some time out to join us.
First of all, it's always a pleasure to spend time with you. But I was chuckling when you referenced that disastrous Michigan game against Appalachian State. And the fact that you and I have maintained our great friendship in spite of that is nothing but a miracle. But I knew you had, I said to myself, he's going to work it in there. Fine, did it. We can now move on.
I couldn't let that one slide. That was just, for folks that live here in the Appalachian Mountains, that's one of those things that's gonna, it's gonna linger for a long time. But
can we move on?
All right. Well, listen, you certainly, keep up with world events and politics here in the state. And you're in Salt Lake City right now, but you're frequently back in Israel with your family. And I thought that provides a unique perspective that I think our audience would be interested in. So let's start with, in Israel. I think a lot of Americans are essentially clueless about Israel and what life is like there. I know that about a week before the October 7th, 2024 Hamas attack, you were in Israel, and you and your family were subjected to an Iranian missile attack. So I guess what I'd ask you to do, if you could describe what day-to-day life was like in Israel before October the 7th.
So it's interesting the way you frame it. They're clearly, for Israelis, or for most Israelis, life before October 7th, 2023, and life after October 7th, 2023. And it is, as you referenced, the book that I've finished, it's the closest day in contemporary Israel to the Holocaust. And I think that's really important in terms of how we frame that Saturday, and where are we now, 15, 16 months later. And you are right that it was in April of, I think, 2024, and then also sometime this summer, that indeed I spent time, April 2024, I was on a flight leaving from from wherever in America to Israel. The flight was canceled at the last moment because of the incoming from Iran. And then whenever there was another incoming from Iran, I think in October, I confess, Mo, because for all of us Israelis, the dates have run together so much. But you're right. I spent time in a bomb shelter with my son-in-law, with my granddaughters, another time with a friend, my wife, daughter, and one of the grandchildren. It's a reality. And when you ask about how life is for Israelis, I think it's going to depend on, first of all, where they live. So we live outside Jerusalem. And obviously, as I say, we have spent time in the bomb shelter. People who live in southern Israel and the Gaza border, I can't imagine what life is like after October 7th. And then for people who live on the northern border on Lebanon, for instance, we have family that have been evacuated. They are now living in their, I think, fourth residence in the past 14, 15 months. And that obviously takes a toll every which way on Sunday. But on the other hand, I was in Tel Aviv in December or January. I don't remember which one, sorry. And I finished a meeting and there was an air raid siren and you run to the shelter and everybody's there. Those who know each other know each other. Those who don't know each other don't know each other. And the air raid ends the Iron Dome. And then you just go back to the street and you go on with life as if nothing. And I think that's important for people to understand that it depends on where you live. You have X seconds to run from where you are into the shelter or, again, wherever you live. I think never say everybody, but for many of us, maybe I can only testify as to myself, when the air raid siren ends, you simply run, yes, ends, and then you go on with your meetings. And I think that that's essential because the last thing you want to do, again, speaking only for myself, Mo, is you never want to give the other side the sense that they are wearing you down, that they are preventing you from going about your normal daily life. And perhaps that's difficult for people who've never had the privilege, quote unquote, of being in an air raid shelter or during the Iron Dome type siren, that it ends and you go back to whatever you were doing. Because I think otherwise you quote unquote give in. And that's, again, speaking only for myself and for I'm sure my family also, absolutely refuse to go there. And you go back to the street, you go back to your meeting, you go back to whatever you were doing, and life continues. Because otherwise you fall down or go down that dark rabbit hole, which I think most of us absolutely refuse to.
I think on October 7th, you were in Israel at the time.
No, I was actually, my wife and I were on vacation in Paris.
Hmm.
It was Saturday morning, October 7th, 2023. And my wife woke me up. She kicked me and she said, "We're at war." And I confess, I have no idea, I had no idea what the hell she was talking about. Because we were in Paris. What war? I said, "What are you talking about?" She said that our daughter had just texted her that what had happened. We turned on the BBC and indeed we saw. And I think like anybody and everybody else, we were flabbergasted would be the polite word. Horrified would be the more correct word. And then we obviously looked for a flight to leave Paris as quickly as possible. We obviously ended our vacation, wanted to come home immediately. And I think it took a while to understand the extent, not only of the IDF's, the Israel Defense Forces, utter and total failure, but I think more painfully the extent of the unmitigated, unimaginable harm to innocent Israelis, whether those who were killed in their homes in the kibbutzim and the communities near the Gaza border, those who were taken hostage to Gaza, and then anybody could watch this on YouTube to see what Hamas and or Gazans, which is also an interesting question, were doing to the hostages. The rape of the women, the sexual assault of the women, the killing of the women, the rape and killing of the women. And I remember watching this and you're like, it can't be happening. And then you understand it is happening. And then we were getting texts on the terrorists are moving their way towards Tel Aviv. And all that is happening, simultaneous. Took a few days for us to, I think, recognize, if I think back, there are 200 or so, right? 240 Israelis held hostage, that the women were subjected to sexual violence on a level that is beyond unimaginable. And we also now know, because one of the male hostages who's been freed has made the decision, and I applaud him, that he too was sexually violated. And I applaud him for his courage. And we know about the women, the sexual violence against women. And the more you read, and the more you read, and then started the call-ups of reserve soldiers. As you well know, the IDF is a standing army, is a small army. We're reservist based, and I think that at the maximum, the number was 300,000. If you do easy math, which I'm not good at, we're a population of 10 million. Of the 10 million, 15% are Hasidic Orthodox Jews who don't serve in the military. 15% are Israeli Arabs, the majority of which, overwhelming majority, don't serve in the army. We're down to 70%. 70% of 10 million is, 7 million? 300,000 Mo is, was that 15 million Americans being called up to reserve duty for a very long extended period. The economic impact on that, huge. People's businesses were closed. The social costs, I don't think we really fully appreciate the social causes yet. And in the meantime, soldiers were being killed, soldiers were being wounded. And it was also clear that the government was not functioning whatsoever. So much so, I remember when we came back from Paris, I was asked to volunteer at a center in Jerusalem, and I was tasked with raising money. Why was I raising money? Because the government was non-functioning, and we were raising money from people worldwide, which in retrospect, I'm glad I did it, but beyond outrageous that the government was so non-functioning that we needed to raise money in order to buy soldiers basic equipment. I mean, it's an utter collapse of the government. And that's something that down the road, we as Israelis will need to address.
How about day-to-day life for ordinary Israelis? Is it a marked change since October 7th?
It's going to depend on the day. So today's Monday. When hostages were released on Saturday, the three males who literally were emaciated. It was a shock in our face, or shock for us to see them. It literally brought back visions of the Holocaust, of Auschwitz. I think Saturday in Israel was a really bad day. Today's Monday, and Hamas is supposed to release more hostages on whatever it is this weekend. A couple hours ago, they said they won't do it. Now it's unclear if they'll do it. And you literally are living from announcement to announcement. On the other hand, to your question, people have a business to attend. People go to school. People have lives. There was I'm a huge fan of the Jerusalem basketball team in the Israeli league. There was now a game in Jerusalem, and thousands upon thousands of people go. Last week, my son and my daughter-in-law took our grandson to a game, because you want life to continue. You can't raise your arms and say, in Yiddish, oy vey, and that's it. So life continues. People in Tel Aviv, you'll see restaurants filled, coffee houses filled. On the other hand, when there's a siren, everything changes. And when we hear that soldiers, the way it works in Israel, I don't know how it works here in the States, Mo, but we're not told that a soldier is killed until his parents know. And so during the course of the day, you're given there are code words that are used on the radio. And then you hear that X number of soldiers have been killed, and that takes us all back, to where we were. And it's a stark reminder that we are still in it. On the other hand, you want to go to a coffee house, or you want to go spend time with your family. And there is that, I don't know if yin and yang is the good word, but one day here, one day there, and it can all turn on a dime. For instance, when Hamas said that they won't release the hostages this coming weekend, the IDF went on immediate high alert. That's significant. We all have kids, right? We all have family. It's not like, I think, not to be flippant, Mo, it's not like living in Geneva. How's that?
Right. Just as an aside, you mentioned being a fan of basketball. Here in Asheville, UNC Asheville had their starter player last year was Drew Pember, and Drew's playing over in Israel now for a professional team. So
the only question is, what team does he play for? Because that will determine whether we can continue our conversation or not.
I'm going to butcher the name. It's Netanya. Is that
no?
Right?
That's okay. We can stay friends. Okay.
Okay. One thing I've always appreciated about you is that you have a very balanced perspective. It seems like, on a lot of issues, people, it's a very binary thing where there's right and wrong, good and bad, virtue and evil. And it seems like with Israel and, what happened on, October 7th, I think, everyone was just stunned and shocked and saddened by what happened. And then over the months, I think folks have also been, saddened and outraged over, the suffering of Palestinians who, weren't part of Hamas. And it seems like too many people want to, say you've got to choose one or the other. And it's, to me, more nuanced than that. So I'm just curious in your perspective on how do you balance the two?
So I think we are all aware to varying degrees of what is happening in Gaza as a consequence of October the 7th with respect to the actions of the IDF. I think anybody who turns on their TV or social media, you can see that. And obviously there's a delineation between Hamas and innocent Gazans, but there are going to be a couple of buts which may well irritate your distinguished audience. One, in either 2003 or 2004, Hamas won democratic elections in Gaza. The Gazan population voted for Hamas. Is this what they voted for or not? I don't know. But Hamas won the election. And I want to emphasize that that election was as democratic can be democratic. To make October the 7th happen requires a pretty significant infrastructure that goes well beyond the members of Hamas who crossed into Israel and killed the Israelis, or those from Hamas who grabbed the Israeli hostages. And it's very interesting to ask, call it the center left in Israel. Are you aware of, and you get these conversations, they're difficult conversations. Are you aware of what's happening in Gaza? Yes. Does it bother you what's happening in Gaza? Yes, but more important for me are the fate of the hostages. Okay. Does it bother you that it doesn't really bother you? And you get, some people will say yes, but as long as they are keeping the hostages in tunnels, as long as they are holding men, women, and there are at least, we know of 2 infants who have been held since October the 7th. One of the questions in Israeli society is how will the public react if and when Hamas announces that these 2 infants were killed? I have no idea how the public will react to that. I know how the public reacted on Saturday when they saw the 3 emaciated Israelis. So sure, we're all aware of the graphics and soldiers we come home from reserve duty and report. And there are soldiers, to their credit, who've been very, very critical of the IDF's actions. They think it's problematic. Perhaps there are those who think that it violates the laws of war. On the other hand, what will always be remembered is I don't know if I like this word, so you'll excuse me, the utter rampage, unhinged behavior on October 7th. And that very much is, for many of us, front and center. But what's going to complicate the complication, if that weren't complicated enough, is I remind you that before October the 7th, after the Netanyahu government, after this government came into power, when they announced what's called the judicial reform, which is nothing more than the evisceration of the rule of law, it took us a couple of weeks to understand that this is actually threatening democracy. And within a few weeks, you had 400,000 to 500,000 Israelis every Saturday night demonstrating. That's 20 million Americans every Saturday night demonstrating. Now we're back to demonstrating against that because we understand the government, in spite of what's going on in Gaza, wants to reinitiate the engagement with evisceration of the judicial reform. So yes, what's happening in Gaza is problematic as hell. I mean, the pictures are awful. The fact that innocents have been killed, awful. But I'm going to give you another but. X percentage of those innocents who were killed, all fault with Hamas for turning them into human shields. And for that, Hamas needs to be held responsible and accountable. We're in addition to that, I remind you that as Israelis, we are in a 7-front war. The Houthis fire the missiles from Yemen. We have Jewish terrorism in the West Bank. We have Palestinian terrorism in the West Bank. I'm not exactly sure what Syria is today. I'm not sure Hezbollah to where. We have Hamas, and we also have Iran. So we're in a 7-front war, small country, small army. And were that not complicated enough, I remind you that our prime minister is on trial, serious criminal offenses. He's on trial in Tel Aviv, in the district court, either in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. He is going to make every effort not to work for the release of the remaining hostages, because it's been made very clear to him by the extreme right-wing members of his government, remember, coalition government, parliamentary democracy, that if he goes forward and releases all the hostages, which implies a 100% ceasefire, they will leave his government. If his government collapses, he's no longer prime minister. The trial will pick up from one day, in terms of hearing him, he's testifying his own behalf, from once every 2 weeks to 3-4 times a week. Netanyahu knows as well as I do, that the court will convict him. And he also knows that if he's convicted, there's a fair chance that he'll go to jail. I mean, these are serious criminal offenses. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's very clear in the last, not only days, weeks, he has no interest in seeing conclusion of the 2 or 3 stage hostage release ceasefire. That is call that a serious problem is an all-time understatement.
Yeah, I remember, when they had the election in Gaza and being shocked at the outcome, but I felt the same way in November. If we're here in America,
But don't forget that Hamas replaced the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, which was corrupt. Palestinian Authority rules the West Bank. Palestinian Authority ruled Gaza until they were voting out. And I think that from 1994 to 1999, officially I was involved, while serving the IDF, I was involved in implementation of the Oslo peace process with respect to Gaza. And then from 2010 to 2018-19, I've been involved in pretty significant track two negotiations. Track two is unofficial negotiations between us. And here's what's critical to your question, with representatives of the PA from the West Bank, whose condition to participating in the conversations was a twofold condition. One, that there be nobody from Hamas participating, and two, that Gaza not be on the table. So when people ask me, is there a chance for a two-state solution? The first question is, two-state with whom? With us Israelis only with the West Bank, or with Gaza? And what will the West Bank do without the Gaza Strip? And as easy as it is to say, as tempting as to say two-state solution, I recall that one of the PA representatives with who I spent a significant amount of time told me once, he said, leave us alone until we get our own house in order. And it's clear that that house is not in order. And therefore, when I'm asked, where's all this leading, we haven't even discussed President Trump's plan about what's it called, Mo? The Riviera in Gaza.
Right.
Right. The Palestinian West Bank versus West Bank, Gaza, Hamas, Palestinian Authority. That's an issue that they are going to have to resolve that we certainly can't resolve for them.
As you're describing, Netanyahu having, in fact, you have an article, I think, came out today on the Oxford Diplomatic
It's coming out this
Society.
week. I'll send you the link. Yes.
Yeah. Where you talk about what you were just describing, where Netanyahu really has no interest in seeing this concluded because his personal, he has a personal stake in keeping the controversy going. It reminds me of Trump. And, we had the border security, the bipartisan border deal that, is imminently going to be passed. And then Trump intervened and stopped it because for him, keeping the crisis going was to his advantage, and solving the problem would be detrimental to him. So it seems like there are a lot of similarities between Trump and Netanyahu. I mean, they both, they're close in age. They're obviously, Netanyahu was here over the weekend. They're obviously quite close. Both
I don't know. I'm going to respectfully be careful on that one. I think that Trump is so transactional and Netanyahu is such a fanboy. I don't know. Do you have close relations under those circumstances? They're not friends like you and I are friends.
Right. Yeah. Well, it seems like they're both had this like aura of corruption around
100%.
them. And you described in your article that, Netanyahu, is surrounded by sycophants and self-serving loyalists, which sounds an awful lot like the criteria to get a government job now under Trump.
I think, as I understand it, you know more than I do. I read somewhere yesterday on Saturday that people who were interviewed for jobs by Trump were not asked, will you be loyal to the Constitution of the United States of America, but were asked, will you be loyal to me? By the way, Netanyahu did this exact same thing when he was appointing the head of the Mossad, our CIA. By all accounts, undenied. There were two last candidates, A and B. And he asked them, are you loyal? Will you be loyal to me? And one said, I'll be loyal to the state. And the other said, I will be loyal to you. And you know who got the job.
Yeah, as I said, I think there are a lot of parallels between the two of them. I'm curious what you think is going to happen. Like I said, they're both. Netanyahu's 75, Trump's 78. Obviously, at some point, they leave the stage. What do you see for Israel and the U.S. when the two of them are out of the picture?
Well, first of all, I'm hoping that Netanyahu, because maybe the government will fall and there'll be new elections and he'll be out of office before our conversation ends, right? I think that as Israelis, and I keep telling Israeli friends of mine, President Biden will be the last American president who has any true empathy, understanding of the Holocaust. I think that's where we need to begin with that. And you may think of President Biden, what you want to think of him, but when he came to Israel 2 years ago and came to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Center in Jerusalem, and was literally on his knee in front of a Holocaust survivor, that's not going to happen again. And I think Israelis are going to have to adjust to, again, you certainly don't have to agree with me, that the Democratic Party that, for instance, I'm older than you, the Democratic Party that I grew up on, which was empathetic, sensitive to Israel, understanding of Israel, I'm not sure where the Democratic Party goes moving forward. And I think that's an issue. I think also that, again, I certainly don't mean to offend anybody, Netanyahu, when he was now in Washington, refused to meet with the American Jewish community. Extraordinary. He's willing to meet with evangelical leadership because he has some kind of a relationship with them. But again, as I tell Israeli friends, no disrespect to your audience, I think we Israelis need to be careful with that because I'm not sure the depth of that relationship. I think that Republicans they perceive themselves as pro-Israel, a phrase I have no idea what that means, view us Israelis as the vanguard of counterterrorism, and maybe there's an element of something, maybe you know better than I do, anti-Muslim there, which I think is highly, 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 highly problematic. And I don't really know how deep that pro-Israel is. So when I listen to certain members of either of Trump's administration or other Republicans talk about Israel, they're talking about Netanyahu's Israel, which is not my Israel. Netanyahu's Israel is illiberal, right-wing, borderline right-wing with fascist members of the government. That's not my Israel. And I tell my Israeli friends, we need to be very, very, very careful of that kind of a bear hug, which can have negative consequences.
In your article that's coming out, you said the greatest threat to Israel is not from without, it's from within. And let me just quote a paragraph out of what your article. You said, this is an uncomfortable issue for the government to tackle as the threat emanates from the extreme right wing whose support, whether cabinet members or former cabinet ministers, is essential for Netanyahu's survival. Their support is conditioned on the government's determinedly failing to resolve these dilemmas. What are you saying there?
Well, first of all, when you look at Jewish terrorism in the West Bank, whether it's burning Palestinian homes, causing terrible damage to Palestinian property. A few years ago, they burned a Palestinian baby. That's Jewish terrorism. This government wink and a nod with respect to that. That is highly, highly problematic. First of all, the crime should be prosecuted. The crime is awful. And in a previous article that was, if I recall correctly, Moe, published by The Hill, I used the word pogrom to describe Jewish terrorism. Trust me, not everybody was happy with me for all the obvious reasons, but I really believe that Jews who go into West Bank communities and burn, that takes me back to, pogroms. Go watch Fiddler on the Roof. And the government wink and a nod. More than that, I think you know that we in Israel have something called administrative detention, which I don't think has ever been adopted by the U.S. military, the U.S. government. The new defense minister was utterly unqualified for the job. He's as qualified as I have long hair, and you know that I don't have hair. He made the decision to announce that there will be no more administrative detentions of Jews. That's outrageous. Administrative detention of Palestinians, yes. No administrative detention of Jews. That's a double standard in the legal system that no rule of law can allow itself. That's problematic. When I use the word illiberal or Jewish terrorism and the wink and the nod, it's exactly what I meant.
Yeah, you mentioned in your article about the politicization of law enforcement and police, which also seems to be an issue here. So
I've been to, I don't know how many demonstrations. When you go to demonstrations, you get verbally assaulted by Netanyahu supporters. But trust me, as I think I wrote there, trust me, I give as good as I get, right? Being physically accosted by the police when there was no reason, no justification, that's different. And you see, when we use the word police violence in Israel, it's not like in America. We don't have shootings. We don't have, those terrible beatings. We don't have that. But we absolutely have pretty physical / violent, unnecessarily physical arrests. I've gone toe-to-toe. My wife has gone toe-to-toe with cops. I've been physically, grabbed by my lapels, and thrown 30, 40 yards. It's not fun. And the moment, and I tell you, in this particular instance, we were demonstrating where we were allowed to be demonstrating against the judicial reform, and we were allowed to be. And then all of a sudden, the police officer, the officer in charge, closed that area. And I went up to him for no reason whatsoever. And I went up to him and I said, Mr. Officer, my name is, and I happen to be a lawyer. And I'm wondering, basis of what did you just make the decision you made? Yeah, I was very, very polite. I was polite. And he said, I am the authority, in Hebrew. And I said to him, Mr. Officer, those are probably the scariest words that a member of law enforcement can say. I am the authority. And I said to him, I remind you, sir, respectfully, I'm a lawyer, in response to which he indeed grabbed me by the lapels and chucked me. My kid, who's far stronger than I am, went up to him and said, you can't do that to my dad. He's older, blah, blah, blah. And returned, the police officer grabbed my kid and threw him further than he had thrown me. That's politicization of the police. The politicization of the police, where they are protecting the government and not protecting me. No democracy can allow itself that.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate. I'm afraid that's what we're seeing more and more of here, which is ironic. That the far right's the one that assaulted law enforcement at the Capitol, but still there's so many in law enforcement that seem to side with the far right. It seems like there are a lot of similarities between the U.S. and Israel with this left-right divide. And certainly here in the U.S., propaganda, has played a big role, in my estimation, in creating that divide and fomenting it for whatever reason. Is propaganda
Huge,
a big issue in Israel as well?
Netanyahu is the master of vile incitement, 100%. He's good at three things. He's a pathological liar on a good day. He's the master of incitement, and he's the master of not making any decisions. That's what he does well. On the other hand, he, like Trump, has a base that is stuck. It goes with him, what's the expression, hell or high water? But Netanyahu and his ilk, as I think I wrote in the article, we call it in Hebrew, mechonat haral, which translates into English into the propaganda machine, run by his wife and who's going to be investigated by the police, and his son, who left Israel under very suspicious circumstances, who lives in Miami. They have four people who, social media, they are very, very, very good at it. They have targeted freed hostages. They have targeted the families of hostages. They have targeted people like me. We are called regularly traitors, right? That's the most common term, is to call us traitors. But I'll give you an example. A released woman hostage was standing with a sign near a highway when a cab driver got out of the car and physically accosted this woman who had been a hostage. The mother, she's a very dominant and very active mother of a hostage. Her name is Einav. Her son is Matan. There are death threats against her, and they speak of her in a way that you as Americans would never, ever understand how people can talk like that. And I also remind you and your audience, we in Israel, there's no political correctness, there's no kumbaya, there's no sweeteners of society. We are an in-your-face culture in a way that I have no doubt, makes Americans very, very, very uncomfortable. But the fact that the mother of a hostage gets death threats is beyond extraordinary. And it was today's Monday, so it was either yesterday, Sunday, or today, Monday, that at the Knesset and the Parliament, there was a real face-to-face, not a pleasant face-to-face, between Smotrich, who's our Minister of Finance, who is an extreme right-winger. He's what we call in Israel, he's messianic, which some others might call religious nationalist fascist. He and his hostage brother, I think, got into it. When I tell you got into it, I mean got into it. That's what incitement does. I mean, listen, Mo, it's no fun. It's no fun to be called a traitor. I was we live in a little town outside Jerusalem, and we have a shopping mall, and I was in the underground garage parking, and a guy rolled, and I was wearing a shirt calling for the release of the hostages, and he rolled down his window, and I won't tell you on the air what he said to me, but it's unhinged, but that comes from somewhere. That unrestrained hate is the result of Netanyahu's incitement.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the same thing happens here. I get called a traitor quite often. I mean, when I was running for office back in 2020, I swear, I think, I spent 25 years serving the country in uniform, and there quite a few people I ran into, I think, would rather sit down and have a beer with Putin than with me, because they've been, led to believe that, if you're not on their team, then you're just inherently evil, and there's nothing, for a lot of these folks, there's nothing you can do to dissuade them that they've been misled.
I assume you were tagged a traitor in part because of your decision with respect to Guantanamo.
Yes. Yeah, that, I was coddling terrorists because I wouldn't condone torture.
And that makes you a traitor.
Apparently, in the eyes of quite a few on the right, that, unless you adopt their, the ends justify the means and the rules don't apply, then you're not a good American.
I mean, it's the same thing. I served for 20 years in the IDF. I've been called a traitor. Trust me, I've been called much worse than traitor, right? But my kids served, my wife served, and that still makes you a traitor. My wife was called once a Bolshevik, and she went up to the guy and she said to him, "May I just a really quick question for you? Can you tell me what a Bolshevik is?" And he couldn't spell Bolshevik, but he knew enough to know that he had heard it somewhere, and because she was demonstrating, she was a Bolshevik. But that's how incitement works.
Yeah, I see that a lot here. We're particularly on the right. There are buzzwords that like a globalist or socialist that 99% of them don't have a clue what it means, but they know it's something bad, and so they throw it out there without any comprehension of what they think they're saying.
I tell you what's interesting, the words like globalist, he doesn't know enough, but that's the code word for Soros. And there's a lot of anti-Semitism in global when they use the term globalist. Now, whether this guy knows that that's anti-Semitism or not is a different question, which is why I take you back to what I said earlier. When I'm told about that the Republicans are all in for Israel, I'm saying, wait, slow down here. I'd suggest caution with that.
Yeah. In your article, you talk about enablers in your book. We'll talk about your book in a minute, but that's certainly the central point of your book. But enablers include the other branches of government. Like here, the legislature and the legislative and judicial branch are supposed to be a check and balance to avoid an imperial presidency, but they appear to be totally subservient to Trump. And then the fourth estate, the news media, seems to have been whipped into submission. What do you do with when what they're supposed to be the safeguards are now the enablers of what we're seeing?
So I begin with the media, and you may disagree with me, which is perfectly fine. What we would call the mainstream media, New York Times, Washington Post, they were protecting from the public President Biden's true condition. And when America saw the debate, maybe the public was shocked. I'm not sure that the media was totally shocked because maybe they had seen this or they had not seen it because Biden wasn't interacting with the press. That's problematic. That's putting aside, if you ask me, his wife was Jill Biden, like Edith Wilson was an enabler. I think we need to be honest about that. That's problematic. What we see in Israel is we have four TV stations, 4 news stations, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 makes Fox News look like kindergarten. Fox News is child's play compared to our 14. The other 11, 12, 13 each have a reporter, or 2 of them have a reporter who 100% is the courier for Netanyahu. And that's very, very problematic when the media has become the spokesman for a prime minister, especially this prime minister. There are a number of journalists, on the other hand, who to their credit, are reporting the way reporting should be reported. But it is, I agree with you, 100% beyond problematic when the media becomes an enabler, not the enabler, but an enabler. That's very problematic. With respect to, in Israel, our parliament, the Knesset, is largely in name only. They don't really play a role. But as you're right, as I wrote in the article, Netanyahu is surrounded by who he's surrounded by. I ask friends here, here being in the United States, I throw them names. I give them, tell me, how do you respond to this person? Or in terms of how do you define this person, this person, this person? And indeed, there are people who I think would be tagged as Trump's enablers. And you know better than I do, at some point, one assumes everything that we're discussing will come to the front steps of the United States Supreme Court, and we'll see how all that plays out. But in the meantime, if you listen carefully and watch carefully, as I assume as many people are doing, there's clearly an element of enabling here. And some of it, if you ask me, raises serious questions about democracy, which is scary. By the way, that is seriously, to call it scary as hell is an all-time understatement.
Well, I'm sure you've seen where, to me, it's ironic, the whole kind of premise of MAGA was that America first, that we need to look internally and get out of all these international engagements and focus on, within our own borders. But now Trump wants to take over Canada, the Panama Canal, Greenland, and as you mentioned, now turn Gaza into the Riviera. What do you make of all this?
So, Mo, at my age, because remember, I'm much older than you, you know what you know and you know what you don't know. And because for now, for all the obvious reasons, my primary focus is on Israel for all the obvious reasons. But I view much of what you're discussing not to the extent or not to the depth that I engage with Israel, which, again, for the obvious reasons. What always worries me, or what source of concern for me, whether it's a Democratic president or Republican president, is this whole issue which you learned in law school and I learned in law school, which is checks and balances of separation of powers. And I see all these courts issuing TROs. We'll see where that goes to in the Israeli context, because of Netanyahu's full-on evisceration of the rule of law and of the Israeli Supreme Court, maybe you could say by comparison that that raises important questions about the undermining of democracy. And we both know how fragile democracy is, and anything that undermines it, whether it's this era, that area, this president, that president, in response to this event, in response to that event, Lincoln in the Civil War, Roosevelt with the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans for reasons that I think if you gave Roosevelt $1, he wouldn't be able to explain to you why he did it. Those are really, really serious questions because of the fragility of democracy.
What's been the reaction in Israel to Trump's proposal for Gaza?
It's a very interesting question. The initial response was, I think we would say in English, chuckle, chuckle. But then Israelis started saying, and this may irritate particularly people like you who served in the military, people started saying, if the United States of America wants to come to Gaza and begin the process of rebuilding Gaza and having American forces in Gaza rather than Israeli soldiers, welcome. The only problem with this plan is that, as far as I can tell, the President of the United States of America didn't take into consideration there are 1.7 million Gazans who live in Gaza. And I haven't seen anybody suggest something reasonable, rational. No, the Jordanians are going to take them, the Egyptians are going to take them, the Irish are going to take them, the Moroccans are going to take them, the Saudis are going to take them, the Iranians are going to take them. They live in Gaza. And I don't really know this Riviera of Gaza, how it plays out with the fact that there are 1.7 million people who live there. But in Israel, there have been voices that say, if the United States wants to come in and rule Gaza, welcome. With the understanding that the humanitarian issue with respect to the Gazans needs to be addressed. If that leads to the release of the hostages, I think you will see people who will say, interesting. But again, the 1.7 million Gazans is the issue that he can't keep fobbing off and saying, well, they'll go here, they'll go here, they'll go there, they'll go to Turkey, maybe they'll go to North Carolina. That's not going to happen. That's just not realistic. So I'm not sure to what extent this plan has been thought out. Thoroughly thought out. And I saw that, I believe yesterday before the Super Bowl, after the Super Bowl, that game was boring as hell. I have to work that in there. I would suggest to Kansas City to get an offensive line for next year. I really don't know what the thinking is with respect to the 1.7 million Gazans.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of Trump's strategy is to, throw 100 things against the wall and, recognizing some aren't going to stick, but, hoping that some will. But
I think that's correct.
I think a lot of it is not thought through. It's just a notion that occurs to him, and he throws it out there to see if it gets any traction. If it doesn't, he moves on.
You mean like annexing Canada? As I wrote to a friend in Israel yesterday, I wouldn't say no to this and no to that. I'd say we shall see. I really don't know, because obviously the President of the United States of America and his advisors don't call Amos Guiora. I don't know how they sequence this, how they implement this, how they go about doing this on a day in, day out basis. But what's the expression that's been used? Shock and awe. I think that is a pretty accurate articulation of his approach at the moment, including Gaza.
We're seeing here domestically with the dismantling a lot of government agencies. Like, here in Western North Carolina, we're still recovering from Hurricane Helene. And when Secretary Nome was here over the weekend, it was talking about shutting down FEMA. We're also seeing like National Institute of Health. We have Research Triangle Park where a lot of medical research takes place. It's being impacted. But we're also seeing internationally, like pulling out of the WHO, the weakening of NATO. What do you see the implications of the U.S. pulling back, in the international community? What are the implications of that?
Highly, highly problematic. The role of the U.S., if that's the right word, or a withdrawn America back to the 1920s, that is highly problematic. We don't need the U.S. as the world's policeman, but we certainly need a U.S. presence. And the notion of the U.S. disengaging from the world, I don't like this phrase, you and your listeners will pardon me, that scares the hell out of me.
Yeah.
By the way, both as an American, I have no hair, but two hats, both as an Israeli and as an American. That is really problematic, because I think once you, again, you know better than me, once you disengage, it's hard to re-engage. And you know better than I do, the only thing that brought the U.S., I think, the U.S. into World War II was Pearl Harbor. Interesting question. What happens if Japan doesn't attack Pearl Harbor? Would Roosevelt at some point have totally said to Churchill, yes, I'm all in? Or is it what pushed Roosevelt to Churchill, Lend-Lease and all that was Pearl Harbor? Open question.
And we started out, I mentioned that your grandparents were both murdered at Auschwitz. You sent me something this morning about an email that you got. Could you talk a little bit
Sure.
about that?
It's an extraordinary story. Indeed, my paternal grandparents were murdered in Auschwitz on May 26, 1944. In December, was home in Israel and I got an email. The subject line was my grandfather's name, which I've never seen in print before. I've seen his name on a memorial in Hungary, and I've seen his name on his, I found his, what do you call it, property papers that I found in Hungary. That's right. I've never seen his name other than that. But I saw on an email his name, and I was like, what is this? It's 11:30 at night. And I read an email, and it's extraordinary, extraordinary email, that his books that he had taken with him to Auschwitz, because I remember when Jews were deported, like my grandparents, they were told to take suitcases and their goods, clothes, because they were told they're going to resettlement in the East. I do not know what my grandmother took, and I never knew until this what my grandfather took. And it turns out that he brought with him 4 books. And the way it worked is the Jews stood in the selection line with their suitcases. You can see the pictures. And then they were told when they got to the entrance to the crematorium, which obviously they didn't know they were going into the gas chamber of the crematorium, to leave the suitcase and they'll pick it up afterwards, after being cleaned. And in that suitcase, in addition to, I don't know what else he took. By the way, I've never seen a picture of my grandfather. Were 4 books, at least 4 books. Those books made their way from Auschwitz to Nuremberg in Germany, to the home of the arch-Nazi ideologue, Streicher. And at some point over the past years, there, in Streicher's house in Nuremberg, was discovered a private library of 9,000 books. An extraordinary institute in Nuremberg, paid for by the German government, has for the past 30 years sought to find the descendants of the owners of those 9,000 books. And it turns out that there are no words. And they found me in the following way. In 1981, my father had filled out forms of Holocaust survivors at Yad Vashem, where the same place where Biden had gone. And he wrote his name. Our original last name is not Guiora, it's Goldberg. And he wrote his parents' name, and he wrote about the circumstances of when and how they had been murdered in Auschwitz. And it's detective work. It's Columbo. The people who run this institute have a team of literally of sleuths, internet sleuths. They found the document from 1981. They found that my father had taught at the University of Michigan. So they went to the University of Michigan website. They found that my father had passed away in 2015. They found that my father has a son, me, at the University of Utah. They went online to the University of Utah, and that's how they found me. And today, indeed, there's an article about all this, and I am waiting eagerly for the 4 books to arrive from Germany. I last week or 2 weeks ago signed a restitution contract that I am the grandson of, and that I will not sell the books, that I intend, to keep them for ourselves for family reasons. I keep getting asked, what am I going to do with this? Am I going to write about this? It's at the moment so overwhelming. We have a picture of my grandmother, right? I have nothing of my paternal grandfather other than these 4 books that are on their way from Germany to Salt Lake City.
It's pretty incredible. 81 years later.
There are no words. One of the first questions I asked myself, what is their condition? But I finally today, in that article that I sent you, I finally saw a picture of the book, and to the naked eye, it looks like the book, at least one book, is in good shape, because obviously if not, then you go to, what is it called, book restoration. But it's extraordinary.
Yes, it's a pretty neat story.
Totally.
Hey, speaking of books, you have a new one coming out called
Enablers Across the Ages, normalizing the unimaginable. The title is not mine. It came from a friend of mine who, like me, is second generation Holocaust. He's a great, 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 great friend of ours. He, as a matter of fact, painted an extraordinary portrait of my wife at a demonstration. And the book is, the title is his, to his credit. I examined the enabler in Israel today, through also the lens of the Holocaust, through my mother's story. And the book is in the hands of the publisher. And we're looking forward to as well as I do, the inevitable redlining. But it looks at what I did in the book. is I look at societal enablers in the Holocaust, and in context of Netanyahu's enablers, I call them out by name. I explain why they are enablers. And at the end of the day, because as the law professor, the whole point of this project is to criminalize enablers. Yes, we have a law of immunity law for members of the parliament and so on, a member of the Knesset, but I view the enabler as committing a crime, not a moral crime, but a legal crime. I think that at the law school we established the bystander initiative, which works on books, articles, legislative testimonies, essays, interviews, and so on, with the idea of shining a very, 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 very bright light on the enablers and the bystanders, because I've convinced myself that the enabler bystander, particularly the enabler, is essential to the perpetrator. And it is not my phrase, it's from a former research assistant, the ecosystem of enabling, which is responsible for harm that needs to be addressed. And the way to address it systemically rather than tactically is to prosecute the enabler in addition to prosecuting the perpetrator. And that's the enabler. Going after the enabler is not in any way to minimize the harm caused by the perpetrator, but it's to say there's an additional actor whose role is critical to the crime committed.
I look forward to seeing it. And listen, I just want to say thank you for taking some of your time and joining us on Muck You. It's always good to talk to you, and you're a good man. I'm really proud to have you as a friend. So
it's very, very, very mutual. You know that.
Well, thanks. Professor Amos Guiora from the University of Utah School of Law, our guest today on Muck You.
This has been Muck You, hosted today by Colonel Moe Davis with his friend and guest, professor and scholar, Amos Guiora from Utah. Muck You is produced by American Muckrakers, copyright 2025. You can learn more at AmericanMuckrakers.com.